Hello everyone, this is James Shore with another how-to video. I'm recording this on November 28th, 2015. In this chapter, we are building out our tab library using test-driven development. And in the last episode, we had just finished styling the default tab with a class. So if you recall, we have multiple tabs and content for those tabs. And when we initialize this, whatever tab is on top should be styled with its own special style. And that's what we've just implemented. Or really what we've implemented is that the first one will be styled that way, regardless of which one we've set is the default. So now what I'd like to do in this episode is to go around our test-driven development loop again. And I think the next thing we want to do is to make that default tab not just automatically be the first one, but in fact be whichever one is the default. Now, before we do that, this does raise the question of how do we want to specify the default? Right now, we've been specifying it in terms of the default content, but I think it might make more sense if we specified it in terms of the default tab. So if we're going to do that, though, that's kind of a big refactoring. And how do we want to do that is the question. Now, we could make this work either way. The default could be the default content or it could be the default tab. I think the logic is pretty much the same. What we're going to need to do is, if it's the default content, in order to figure out which tab is right, we'll have to look through all of our content to figure out which one matches, and then we'll light up the appropriate tab, or vice versa. But I think from the user's perspective, it makes more sense for the default to be based on the tab rather than the content. I just think that's more intuitive. Now, how can we get to that in small steps? Let's do this. Because they're going to be basically the same, let's go ahead and modify our existing test. We'll fix this issue here where we default to the first tab no matter what. And then I think it'll be easier to make that other change. And if it's not clear on what I'm talking about, I think that will become more obvious as we go as well. So what we need to do is we need to modify this test to style the default tab even when it's not the first one. And I could do that as a separate test, but I don't think there's a lot of value in that. So what I'm going to do is just add a couple of tabs. And the content doesn't really matter, except we do need a default content to pass into this default here. So here for our tabs, we'll say tab 1, default tab, tab 3, and here we'll say just create any old tab and default content, and then create any old tab content, not tab, create any old default content. And then if we do that, then we should assert, well, very similar to the way we're doing our assertions up here. Should be able to assert that tab 1 should not be styled. Our default tab should be styled. And tab 3 should not be styled. And that is effectively the same code. Now this should fail because I think what we're going to get is that tab 1 is being styled. Oh, and this needs to be active tab here, and this needs to be blank. So we're expecting only the default tab will be styled. And I think what's going to happen on this run is that because we're styling the first one, is that we'll get it for tab 1. So let's see what happens. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. It's saying tab 1 should not be styled, expected active tab to equal blank. But we're expecting blank, but we're getting active tab. Good. All right, now the trick is, how do we get this to work? So we're getting in a list of tabs, and we have a default element. And somehow we need to match that to the list of tabs. So I think what we can do here is I think we can say find index of default element. and pass in our content tabs and the default element. So what I'm thinking is that we've got a list, we've got an array of content tabs, right? It's 0, 1, and 2 are going to be the indexes of those content tabs, assuming we have 3. So here we have 0, 1, and 2. And here we have tabs 0, 1, and 2. So if we can figure out which index is the default, then we can use that same index to make our default tab active. So I'm writing a little function to find the index of the default, and then we will write down here, say tabs active index, blah, blah, blah. Now, and we don't need that if statement that was on here before because we now have ensured that we have tabs defined in every case. We did that in the last episode. So this is going to take our content tabs and our default content tab. And to prove that we know what we're doing, we'll just return the correct answer for now. We'll cheat, in other words. And that did not work. Oh, well, now it's different. Now it's saying tab 1 should not be styled. We expected blank, but we got null. So we'll just have to change the values here. I don't know why it's giving us null instead of blank back, but that's all right. There we go. So that's working, but we're not really at a green bar yet. We're just sort of halfway there. So let's continue on. We need to do this right. Now, to really prove that it's not right, I could modify the test, but that seems kind of silly to me. So let's just program this here. I think this is going to be pretty easy though. We just need to say we need to loop through our content tabs. And return as soon as our current content tab, which is this one, equals our default content tab, which is that one, we can just return I. And that's why I used a for loop rather than a for each here, because if you return out of a for each, that doesn't do anything because you're inside another function. But here, by returning as soon as we find it, we don't have to loop through all of them, and we jump out of the entire function because we're using a for loop, which doesn't involve a new function inside of here. So if I did that right, there we go. And I'm going to add a little fail fast code here. Doesn't need to be tested. It just says could not find default in list. And again, that's just a little bit of helpful code for the programmer if they mess up how they call this. Okay, so there we go. We now have this styling the default tab. Let's go ahead and check that in. So we've styled the default tab even when it's not the first one. How can we improve this code? Well, one thing that comes to mind, it's not really related to what we've been working on, but this code here, this fail fast code, this I think could be factored out into something a little more readable. Let's say check option tabs options.tabs. And then we can implement that like this. Check option explanation or name. And then we can implement it by saying if option is undefined, throw new error, expected name. Now, we don't have a test around this, but at least we haven't broken anything we care about. We can do the same thing for content default, active tab class, and content hide class. So that's nice. Not amazing, but nice. And I have on larger projects, I'll often turn these sorts of fail fast functions into a little library. I'll either call it fail fast or ensure or something like that. But I'm not going to do that here because that seems like overkill for this small little project. Similarly, I might make this, a function like unreachable, but I'm not going to do that here. All right, well, that's a nice little refactoring. I'll check that in. So we factored out our option checking code. What else can we do to improve this? This is all right, I think. How about here? I think their tests are okay. Let's look at our to-do list. What can we do next? Well, we finished our active tab code. We have this idea of changing default to refer to the tab rather than the content element, and I like that idea a lot. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, that's going to affect all of our tests, so I'm going to do it just one test at a time. Let's start just with the first one. I'll say run only this test. This is something you can do in Mocha. You can add .only to run just that one test, like this. So you'll see we're only running one test. Or you can say .skip to skip all but that test. And now you'll see it saying it's going to execute 3 of 4 and skip 1. So I'm going to run only this test and modify this to pass through a default tab, which I suppose I'll have to factor out. So I'm going to do the reverse of inlining. I'm going to extract this variable by replacing this with default tab and putting it up here, default tab equals that. And there is a refactoring built into WebStorm. If you're using WebStorm for extract variable, it is called, well, extract variable or Command Option V on the Mac. I believe it's Control Shift V on Windows, but you'll have to double check on that. At any rate, extracting that variable shouldn't cause any problems. And it doesn't. The problem occurs when we change the default from default content to default tab. And that, I believe, will break this test. And it does. And look, there's our fail fast code. Could not find default in list. Fantastic. But this is easily fixed. We will just change the find index of default element from taking the content to taking the tabs. How cool is that? And let's change this to be list and default. No, just, oh, we can't call it default. Let's call it default element. Default's a keyword. And now I think that will work. Whoops, it didn't though. Oh, right. Of course, it's not going to work because now we're changing things around. Now our default element, this is our default tab. Okay, let's put this back and sneak up on it. So if you get to the point where your tests don't work the way that you thought they should, put it back the way it was. Get everything working again, rather than just hacking away and trying to fix it. Okay, so I've undone everything. If I take out the it.only, it should all still be working. And it does. Good. Okay, let's try this again. I'm going to take it a little more slowly. So this here is our default element. Our default, not our default element, our default tab. So let's make that refactoring, and all of our tests should still work. Except it looks like on line 23 of tabs test, I made a typo. Yeah. Right. Somehow I put it's in there. Okay, there we go. That's all working. So that's our default tab. Now we're also going to have default content, right? Which is just our default element. And that's just fine. And we can take this, our active element, and we can say that we can put that up here so that we have our default tab and our default content together. The reason I'm doing this is because I know that in order to switch these two around, I'm going to have to change this code to use these variables. So this should all work still, and it does. So now what I can do is I can say default content .class list.remove content hide class. So what we're doing is we're looping through all of our content elements, adding the hide class to all of them, and then removing it from the default. And then we're adding the active tab class to our default tab. And that should work just fine. See how we can do refactorings in small steps without just hacking away at things. So now if I switch this around, so let's just run this one, let's modify this to pass through the default tab rather than the default content. If I switch these around, now the default tab is the default element, and the default content is going to be content active index. And the default element, or really default tab, is going to be inside the list of tabs. And let's rename default element to be default tab. And this was incorrectly named. And if I've done that right, this should still work. Except that we're redefining default tab, and that's okay. I'll just pull that out. There we go. That's working there. Now it won't work on the next test because we're passing the wrong tab through. And that is exactly correct. But we can make a default tab here. And we can pass it through here. And we can pass it through here. And that should work. And it does. And then that leaves this test, which will fail. But we can fix just by passing through the correct thing. And there we go. So now we've modified our initialize function to take a default tab rather than default content element. And I think that is an improvement. And also this code is starting to look a lot prettier. In fact, I think what I'd like to do is start to pull out methods to make this more readable. Let me check in what I've got so far though. So we've switched our default to take default tab rather than default content. And I think I'd like to do another refactoring, which is to modify the options to say default tab here. Because default is a keyword, you can use it in an object like this, but it looks weird to me. And also our browser keeps highlighting it. If we do it this way, I think that'll be more readable. And that worked just fine. Let's check that in. We've renamed options.default to options.default tab. And now looking at this, this is about hide all content. And this is about make one tab active. And I'm wondering if we want to put those into functions. Let's wait on that. Let's wait on that. I'm not sure what's going to happen when we get to our next task. But now we have changed default to refer to the tab rather than content element. We have this note here to rename content hide class to hidden content class. Let's go ahead and do that. It's easily enough done. We just say content hide class becomes hidden content class. This we can rename to hidden content class. And then here, we'll rename all of them as well. And that does it. So that wraps up marking a tab as active. Now we still have another test here about preserving existing classes on the active tab. And I think that would be worthwhile to implement. But I'm going to leave that as a challenge for you to think about over the break. So your exercise for this time, as usual, follow along with what we've done so far. Modify your test to support styling the default tab, even when the default tab is not the first one. That means that you'll need to pull through this find index of default element code. Then go through and make whatever refactorings you like. I would suggest making the refactorings that we've done so far in terms of modifying the default to take a tab rather than the content, and looking at how you can clean up your tests and your production code as well. If you're doing the challenge exercises, go ahead and do this next test, preserve existing classes on the active tab, and you might want to think about dealing with clicks as well. That's it for this time. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you next time.